Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, really excited to have this conversation. I know that you have had a long and storied career, both in large company culture, but also in the startup world. So I'd love to maybe kind of kick it off there. Kind of went through a bio here in the intro, but just tell us a little bit more about, I guess, your path prior to Techstars and maybe kind of how that shapes your journey in getting here to this point.
Yeah, it was funny. I'm going to date myself a little bit, but when I took the entrepreneurship class that I took in college, there were exactly 0 internet companies that got pitched that year. And things have changed quite a bit. So I did my first tech startup back in 1998 in San Diego, learned a lot from the failure there, bounced around at a couple of small tech startups and found myself up in Silicon Valley and kind of like rode through a couple of boom and bust cycles at companies like Yahoo and eBay. But I've been working exclusively with smaller, earlier stage companies since about 2008, a couple of my own. And most recently, like for the last several years, I was a managing director at Techstars, where I've had the good fortune to work with 44 different companies in fields as varied from robotics to HR software to a mushroom farm.
Amazing. A mushroom farm. We're going to have to
there's a mushroom farm in Brooklyn. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll have to dig into that later for sure. But in the meantime, so, I know that the traditional Techstars program functions, in actual cities with kind of geographical targets. So I'd love to hear just kind of firsthand from you, like what was some of the vision behind going with the Anywhere program, which is what you operate now. So what was kind of the longer term vision, and why roll out, a remote program when the city focused one has worked so well to this point?
It has worked really well. We run 40 some odd, accelerators around the world now. And I actually ran 2. I ran one here in San Diego and another one in London that were kind of that location-based kind of program. And, it's a really great opportunity to get everybody together in the same space. Everybody gets to know each other really well. But one of the things that we've noticed along the way, after having invested in, a lot of companies and seeing, exponentially more applications come through, is that we kept running into founders who would be really interested in working with Techstars, who we were really interested in working with, who for whatever reason couldn't make that relocation move, right? They couldn't move to Austin or Berlin or Los Angeles for 3 months. And then there's a bunch of reasons for that, right? Maybe they've got family. Maybe they've got customers, right? Like, companies with like customers and employees, where like extracting the founders for 90 days is challenging for them. And so we started thinking about like how work has changed over the course of the last several years. Tools like this, like Zoom that we're working with, have allowed us to have conversations, to be close, to be spontaneous in ways that we never could previously remotely. And I think a lot of the value that comes from being part of Techstars is exposure into the network, right? And that network that we've got at Techstars is global. It's worldwide. And the reason why it exists is to help entrepreneurs succeed. And the question that we asked ourselves is, can we take this network? Can we create virtual access to it so that founders can stay in Columbus or Portland or Nova Scotia and have the opportunity to meet the mentors and meet the investors and learn from each other and learn from the folks that are in this network that have been there and done that before them. And so we created Techstars Anywhere, with the idea being that great founders can come from anywhere, and that what we can do is we can help mentor them, we can help connect them, we can bring them into this network, and we can give them access that might not otherwise be available to them. And by doing that, we've got the opportunity to work with some really great founders who we might not otherwise have the opportunity to work with before.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you touched on this idea of, how work is changing, and there's this big conversation going on right now about the future of work. I'm interested in particular, given your experience, as an investor and somebody who's been in the startup side of things, how do you feel like the remote model could impact traditional centers of innovation like the Valley and, Austin or New York or whatever it might be? But do you see that changing kind of where there's these centers of, investment in startups?
So we've put 24 companies through Techstars Anywhere so far. And we've got one founder based in the Bay Area out of the, figure 2 point whatever founders per company. And we've had one based in the Bay Area. And I think that one of the things that it's underscoring for us is first of all, just to be clear, like, we think that the Bay is a terrific place to start a company. We think it's a terrific place to grow a company. It's a great place to raise money and hire really traditional talent. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's not the only place to do those things. Having been, part of that ecosystem for so long, it's an important part of my career and my experience. And I think that, one of the things that we're really focused on is like being pro everywhere else, right? Like there's, I think, a lot of momentum behind that, like what Steve Case is doing with his Rise of the Rest tour in terms of like, shining a spotlight on some of these other communities. But from a startup perspective, I think it does a couple of things, right? Number one is like, there's founders all over the place who have great ideas, right? And in order to go ahead and execute against a great idea, you need to have access to a lot of things. And in some places, it's just hard to get access to. You need to get access to talent. You need to get access to capital. You need to get access to mentors and people who will share their experience with you. And those things might not always be around the corner or in the top floor of your building or whatever. And I think that what the remote work concept allows us to do is it allows us to build bridges from communities that have historically been underserved from an entrepreneurial ecosystem perspective to those resources wherever they happen to be. You're a mentor for the Techstars Anywhere program, and we love it because, like, you don't have to be in the same city as the founders who come through the program in order to be able to step in and help. And so founders from Atlanta and Columbus and San Diego all have the opportunity to work directly with you on things that are important and can be real game changers for their business. And you don't have to get on a plane. They don't have to get on a plane. And so I think one of the things that's really exciting for us is the ability to be able to tap into this worldwide network that Techstars has built of great mentors, of great investors, of great founders, and provide those connections to people who may not have that opportunity otherwise.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a great vision. And I think we're seeing that just, in speaking with other founders of remote companies, like we're seeing that same advantage play out with, hiring folks no matter where they are, right? Opening up that pool, releasing that constraint geographically.
Well, and there can be a lot of cost savings that go along with it too, right? Like hiring somebody in the Midwest is going to be a lot less expensive than hiring somebody in San Francisco. And you also don't have to limit yourself to a geography in terms of where you can hire from, right? You got like this huge pool of people, of talent that you can tap into, that can provide like a really great advantage. We've got one company from our last class who has scaled up. They were 3 guys when they came in, plus 1 employee, and now they're 20 people like a year later with a fully remote team spread all around the world. And they've been able to attract and hire great talent, not limited by any kind of geography. So it's been really helpful for them.
That's amazing. That's so cool. I imagine too, like there's obviously a geographical diversity to the companies and the founders you can work with, but that must also in some ways enable just cultural diversity and other forms of diversity as well in terms of the founders that you're reaching.
It really is. One of the things that we've tried to do at Techstars Anywhere is to make it be accessible, right? By not requiring people to relocate or uproot for a couple of months. One of the things that we've tried to do is say, like, this is something not just for anywhere, but for anyone. And I think that we've been pretty successful in that. I think that we've got a really great diverse group of founders. Parents, for example, like, that's a group of founders that have, they've got experience. They've been around for a while. Like they've done things and they can't move to Seattle if they don't live in Seattle. And so, that's one of the things that we've seen. And so I think that by really focusing on making the program and the network accessible, it's helped us with being able to go out and, recruit diverse founders who come from, different places, different backgrounds. And I think that that's been a real benefit to the program.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so I know that from being a part of Techstars Anywhere, I know that though the program is remote, you also have moments where you're spending time in person during the program. So maybe you can walk us through a little bit about how that plays a role and kind of what your experience has been in having those in-person meetings as well.
It's a really great point because you can get a lot done over a video call. You can get a lot done in Slack. You can get a lot done in shared Google Docs. Like you can send a lot of Vox messages back and forth or WhatsApps or whatever. But there's something about relationship building that is better in person, right? Like when you're like getting to know someone and when you're developing a relationship, like being able to like shake hands or like have a hug or whatever it is, right? Like physical, like being there it goes a really long way. And so what we do is that we travel a little bit. We spent the first week of Techstars Anywhere in Los Angeles this year. We just got back from a really great trip to Boulder, Colorado. And in just under a month, we're going to be heading up to New York. And our goal in each of those things is really to focus on relationship building, right? Like having the founders build relationships with each other, build relationships with the local Techstars community, local founders, local mentors, and local investors. And one of the things that I think is really critical for any founder starting any kind of business is to be very deliberate about looking at relationships like in a non-transactional way, right? Like that this isn't just like, can I meet somebody and ask for a favor, but it's how do I establish and then build a relationship over time so that, I'm not looking at things as just like, hey, can you give me an introduction, or, can you connect me with an investor, but that I'm building a team of people around myself who care, right? And who want to be there to help and who are going to be there for a long time rather than just for a single transaction. And I think that being together in person, whether, you're part of an accelerator like this one, or whether, you're building a remote company, like having those moments to get everybody together, like in one place, I think is really critical.
Absolutely. Yeah. And kind of in my experience and the experience of kind of other guests that have had on the show, those moments together count for so much more when you don't actually have them, right? So you're almost like taking advantage of them on a new level.
The crazy thing about it is like a lot of people, like when we first, this is our third year of Techstars Anywhere, right? So we've learned a lot over the course of the last 3 years, but one of the questions we would get a lot is, are the relationships that you develop different? And like, I don't know, did you ever go to summer camp when you were a kid?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Like, so you go to summer camp, right? Like, in a little cabin in your bunk beds and everything like that. And you're there for like a week and you get there and like, you don't know any of the other kids. And like at the end of that week, these are your best friends in the world, right? It was crying, you're going to miss everything. Like, and I think part of the reason is because you take people and you put them together and you give them kind of like this intense shared experience that's scarce, right? Like they share it with a small number of people. And at Techstars Anywhere, like these founders get together and they get to know each other and they like each other because they're all super interesting people. And then they go home, right? And they wait a couple of weeks and they like this anticipation builds up and then they get back together. Yeah. And then they go home. And by creating, I think, these really unique shared experiences that have short duration and high intensity, like what happens that we've seen is that the relationships that these founders develop are really strong, like really like real relationships and friendships. And so I'm really, really excited about the way that the peer group comes together and the dynamic that they've got with each other.
Totally. So you're in the third year of the program. You funded 24 companies at this point.
Yep.
What are some of the things that you're looking for in a team, just from an investment standpoint, from this accelerator standpoint? What are some of the things that you're looking for in the team specifically to know that they're going to be able to make it work remotely?
Well, so first of all, I want to be clear that you don't have to be a remote first team in order to participate in Techstars Anywhere, right? We've got solo founders who have large offices with like employees who are part of the program. We've got co-founders who work together out of a co-working space or something like that. So it's not a requirement to be a remote team. However, what we found is that more than half of the teams in the cohort in the class are remote first. And so I think that there's a couple things to look for, right? One is that the team has found the rhythms and the cadences and the processes to be able to work together well. Two is that they've done the work to like make sure that the relationships between the co-founders like are solid and strong, right? Because you can get a lot of work done. You can write a lot of code remotely, but co-founder relationships are really, really special. And so we really dig deep to make sure that like these are co-founders that, even if one's in Minneapolis and one's in Atlanta, right, that they work well together as a team. Beyond that, I think that it's pretty similar to the way that we look at companies across the Techstars network, right? And that's, is this team like talented? Like, do they have the skills and the understanding of the space that they're working in and their customers to be able to execute well? Do they have a vision of what the world looks like with their company in it? Can they share that vision with people and can they get people on board? Have they been able to make progress towards that goal? So there's a lot of things that we look at that are the same as any other Techstars. But for those remote teams, I think it's really about, have they developed the relationships and do they have kind of the working agreements in place that enable them to be like an efficient, high performing team that's remotely based.
Totally. And just kind of a follow-up to that, like some of those things are probably challenging to measure in any sort of quantitative, survey or SurveyMonkey. So what are some of the ways that you've tried to kind of detect, for competence, in those areas?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about startups, about business, about companies is that, at the end of the day, so much is just people, right? And like you get so much from somebody just from having a really interesting conversation with them. Like whether it's like, it's not about like checking boxes or, having like an algorithm with a number that adds up to another number or something like that. But so much of it just comes from, there's some of that, right? But so much of it just comes from working on developing those relationships, asking the questions, having the conversations, and really listening to people, like trying to understand like what they're saying and also what they're not saying. And so, that's something that we spend a lot of time doing with the founders that come through, is getting to know them, like, having those conversations, understanding like what makes them tick, understanding what they're afraid of, like understanding, where they're strong and where they need help. And by, I think, really spending the time to dig in there, like you develop real human relationships, and having those human relationships are really helpful for us when it comes time to, make hard decisions about, the limited number of companies that wind up participating in our accelerator program.
Totally. Yeah. And I imagine too that you guys have even more applicants because of that lack of the geographical constraint than most programs even have to deal with. So that comes into play even more, I would imagine.
Yeah, we don't share like application numbers publicly, but because we've built an accessible program, like it's available to a lot of folks, and so we see that represented in the applicant pool, like pretty nicely.
Totally. So in working with a lot of teams, again, they're not all remote first, but many of them are. You've observed a lot of these teams, like the one that you just described, right? They grew from about 4 people to 20. What are some of the things that those companies are doing right in their hiring process, especially to grow a team that quickly in that short amount of time?
Yeah. So the hiring process is tough, right? Because like every particular role that you hire for, like there's a special kind of person that's like the right fit for that particular kind of role. And so hiring an engineer and hiring a marketing person, like you still have to hire an engineer, you still have to hire a marketing person, and they could be very different. They could be similar. I think what it does is it adds a dimension into it, which is the how do you work dimension, which is really an understanding of like what are the habits that this person has. There's like when you're working remotely, there is a much higher level of intentionality that is required. Like you don't bump into people at the coffee pot, right? Like there's not a lobby that everybody walks through at the same time every morning and says hello to each other. And so, when you've got people coming in different time zones and, different working hours and things like that, I think it's important that folks who want to be remote first workers have that discipline and that intentionality to be able to say, I can keep schedules right. Like I can be like, if we agree as a team that we're going to meet at 5 p.m. Pacific time every night, like I have to commit to doing that. Otherwise the systems break down. I think that finding people who thrive with a certain degree of predictability, or who can at least abide by a certain degree of predictability, we try to do the same things at the same time every week, right? Just so that people know what's coming and they can plan for that. And, if they've got meetings or calls or investor conversations or whatever, that they can work around those types of things. And so I think for founders who are building remote first teams, like finding the kind of people who thrive in those situations, right? Where they've got the discipline, they've got the intentionality, they've got the schedules and the rhythms in place, I think is something that's probably really helpful for building a high performance remote first team.
That's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really, I think that's an interesting point. Just having that regularity is actually really, it's counterintuitive because a lot of remote is just so flexible during the day in terms of when you're working, but having those anchor points so that everybody's just on the same page, this is important. Like make sure that we're showing up for this meeting or that meeting. It's really important.
Yeah. And that's the irony of the whole thing, right? Is like, I don't think that you can be flexible unless you've got a certain degree of predictability, like in everything else, right? I think that predictability is what enables the flexibility, because what it does is it says, like, I trust you to be, back here with me when I need you, and that you'll reach out, when you need me. And so we've got these agreements in place, which takes this time when we're not on the Zoom call or available via Slack or taking phone calls or whatever, and provides that additional degree of flexibility. So I think the two things are kind of like this yin and yang, right? Where it's not rigidity, that's not the right word, but the predictability, the cadence, the rhythms enable the creativity and the flexibility that exists outside of those parameters.
Totally. Yeah. Every canvas has its borders, right? And that kind of inspires creativity. Yeah. So you hit on something really important, I think, for anybody who's considering remote, which is this idea of like creativity and innovation. And being involved at early stage, you see it all the time, right? Where companies have to pivot their products maybe multiple times in a short amount of a year or a couple months, right? So how have you seen in the remote setting specifically some of those moments of innovation and creativity happen? Like, it could be as simple, like, is it calls like this? Is it just, in a messaging platform? But where do those kind of like serendipitous just moments of collaboration happen when you're in a remote environment?
You used a word that I think is really interesting, and that word is serendipity, right? Because so much of what happens is like the right people bump into each other at the right time. And when you're remote, there's like a lot less bumping into each other. Right? There's like the Brownian motion is diminished, and the natural collisions don't occur the same. And so the way that we like to think about it is kind of like manufactured serendipity, right? Like there are things that you can do. There's ways that you can, be active posting in your Slack channels. There's, an over communication. There's a regularity of like email and things like that kind of create these additional opportunities for interactions that are based upon an intentionality designed to create serendipity, right? So if you only respond in Slack messages when you get called by somebody or added in by somebody, like, you will not create the same opportunities for those like creative moments to occur as if you are sharing thoughts, right? Or if you're dropping in ideas. And so I think so much of it comes down to, how do I contribute to the conversation when I'm not like physically present somewhere? And what are the tools that I have that allow me to contribute to that conversation? And how do I leverage those to their fullest extent? Because those are the types of things that we've had in the past. We've had companies, for example, that'll go through a rebrand, and they'll like open up a Slack channel and be like, hey, whenever you get a chance, like, share ideas for new company names, right? And then people just wind up in the Slack channel going, hey, you should call yourselves, make a tech co or whatever it is, right? Like, and by creating those opportunities and by starting those conversations and using the tools in order to enable them, I think companies can go a long way toward, and not just companies, but individual employees can go a long way towards manufacturing that serendipity.
I think you just found your next book title, Manufactured Serendipity.
Manufacturing
there,
right?
Yeah,
exactly.
No, I love that, man. I feel like I've seen that happen even on our own team. It's just this idea of thinking out loud. Like, a lot of it's just taking what would usually be a very personal and internal process and just thinking out loud in Slack or whatever, just so that other people can kind of hop on that train of thought. And it's great. So one thing, so you mentioned a couple tools that you use, right? So I always like to ask people, like, what tool could you not live without, right? Like, what's
our stack?
Critical? Yeah, what's in your stack?
What's in our stack? So our remote stack, it's actually funny. I was in the App Store. I got a new iPhone the other day. I was like going into the App Store, and they're like, "Hey, here's some suggestions for remote workers." And it was basically like the Techstars in our stack, right? We make a lot of use of Voxer, which is kind of like an asynchronous voice messaging app. We do a lot of Zoom, right? Like this is a big thing for us. I spend most of my day looking at people on screens. A lot of Slack. And then a lot of Google Suite, which I think is a really great tool for collaboration on documents and things like that. And that's really kind of like the bulk of it, right? So we have a lot of shared drives. We use a Google site, kind of like share information with all of the companies, kind of like on a publishing or broadcasting perspective. A lot of our conversations happen in Slack. We've got it's a pretty busy and active Slack instance, as you could probably imagine. And then we're constantly just like, copy and pasting Zoom links into Slack, being like, hey, hit me up here. Let's just have like a quick conversation about that. So it's Vox, it's Slack, it's Zoom, it's Google Suite. And if I can, I just got Superhuman for my email the other day. It's a game changer, man. Like email is so big. It's like, yeah, I'm really into Superhuman right now. It's made email fun.
I've had a couple emails come through that have that in the signature, and it's caught my attention. I haven't tried it yet though, but no,
they don't pay me. Like I pay them. Like I'm happy to give some love out to Superhuman because they're doing a great job there.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, so it's funny because a lot of those tools weren't even around, say 3, 4, 5 years ago, right? So it's just the ability to execute now versus even 5 years ago has just completely exploded.
It really has. And when we talk about tools, we talk about manufactured serendipity, all these types of things. I think that there's an important thing to consider too, and that there's like the flip side of all of it also, right? Like I'm really fortunate to work with Kendra, who happens to be behind me, and so we share an office space here, even though all of our founders are remote. But for a couple of years, I've worked from home. Like I've worked as an independent in an office space before, and for some people that can be like a really isolating experience. And so I think that this kind of goes back to this notion of intentionality and for whom is this a good fit, because there's some people who get their energy from like being in the physical presence of other people. There's some people who get their energy from being, by themselves. And I think that most people have some kind of mix of the two of those things. And so it can be an isolating experience, like working remotely, right? You might feel like, hey, I've got a burning question and everybody else is asleep right now. Or, people are working weird hours, or the flexibility kind of like separates people from each other. And so I think it's important for people who are considering joining a remote team to like really be introspective about like what makes them tick, where did they get their energy from, how do they work well, and is this the best kind of role for them to have? And so I think it's important for folks to kind of like think about both sides of the equation there.
Definitely. Yeah, and you mentioned flexibility, which can be a blessing and a curse, right? Like you can work when you want, but you're kind of always on if you let it go that way. So maybe what are some of the ways that you've created hedges to make sure that you are making time for the other things that are important for you in life?
Yeah. One of the things that we do at the very beginning of the program is we kind of come up with a set of working agreements, right? And when you come up with a set of working agreements, these are kind of, a framework that everybody agrees to operate within that kind of like creates and respects boundaries. So for example, I got 3 kids, and when I go home at the end of the evening, like I'll work until late. But when I go home at the end of the evening, I want to have that time at the end of the evening to hang out with my family and do these types of things. And so I don't take phone calls at, after 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I will occasionally if it's an emergency, but that's where something like Voxer is really useful, right? Because somebody can send a voice message and I can listen to it and respond to it when I've got an opportunity to do that. And so I think that by creating these working agreements and by setting the boundaries and like understanding kind of like where everybody's limits are, it allows people to feel free to operate within those boundaries by understanding like how not to go outside of them. And I think that being really transparent, like writing them all down, right? Having everybody, sign them, whether it's virtually or whatever, right? Like we agree that, everybody's got, local time blocked off when they're not gonna, like, what do you do on weekends, right? Like, are weekends like available time or unavailable time? And it's all going to depend on you and your team and like what works best for you. And so I think having a very open conversation about how you're going to be able to thrive, how you're going to be able to find whatever balance or harmony you need, and how you are all going to be able to respect kind of the borders within which everything operates is really important.
Man, that's really a pattern, I think, in even everything that we've talked about today. Is just if this constraint of having, or not constraint, but this model of having everything remote forces intentionality on so many different levels, whether it be creativity, whether it be with boundaries and communication. Yeah. And so that's probably why a lot of folks have been able to grow their companies so quickly this way.
I think so. And I think, I think the word is really good. And what I wish is that it wasn't like the dominion of the remote worker. Like, I think that everybody benefits from being intentional about the things that they do, right? About really understanding kind of like, what's the objective of what I'm trying to get to here? What's the way that I work? What's the way that my colleagues work? Like, how do we work together as a team? And whether you're, in open plan office space with 100 people, or whether you're, a remote team of 6, like really being intentional about when I'm working, when I'm available, when I can be, there's the concept of maker schedules versus manager schedules, right? Maker schedules are like, headphones on, I've got things to build, I've got documents to write, I've got stuff to do. Manager schedules are a lot more focused around schedules and meetings and things like that. And like interrupting somebody who's in the flow, whether they're like at the desk next to you or, 600 miles away remotely, like creates like these ripple effects like through productivity. And so whether you're in person or remote, I think that the whole concept of intentionality and understanding like how people work together is an important thing that every team should focus on understanding about what works best for them. That's
a great point. Yeah, point well taken for sure. I love that. It's not the dominion of the remote worker. This applies to everybody.
Yeah, I totally think so.
Well, listen, man, I wanted to maybe veer to the right for a second, just because I feel like you're in a unique position to answer this. And in your role with Techstars and the companies that you brought into your program, a big part of what you do is teach founders how to raise capital and how to maybe gun for that or get to a place where they're ready for that Series A or a large seed round. What do you feel like other investors are considering when they look at a remote team? Is it different from some of the stuff that you've expressed already? Is it the same? Like, what should founders keep in mind when they are thinking about raising capital and presenting themselves as a remote or just a distributed model in general?
Yeah, it's funny. There's actually been like a lot of kind of like chatter like on this topic, probably less around remote teams and more about kind of like geography, where I think that there are a lot of people, and I mentioned Steve Case and his Rise of the Rest, but there's a lot of other funds that are springing up outside of the valley, right? Like the bulk of venture capital like still exists there, but there's a lot of things that are happening outside of there, and it also seems like just anecdotally that there's a lot more conversation about people saying, hey, listen, I want to be looking outside of this little sphere that we're in up here, like for interesting deals and for interesting opportunities. For founders, I think that there's a couple of things, right? Number one is no matter where you are or what kind of business that you're building, right? Like there are like 2 steps to raising money, right? And step 1 is always build a great business. And so no matter who you are or where you are, like if you don't hit step 1, like fundraising is going to it's already hard, right? But like if you don't hit step 1, build a great business, it's going to be really, really challenging for you. The other thing is that so much of your job as a founder is to like find the right buyer, right? We're having a conversation on this earlier today, right? Where it's not like just throwing as many people as you can into the top of a funnel, but it's really about finding like the right people. And it gets back to this concept of intentionality, right? Which is kind of a thread that runs through all of this stuff. Totally. But there are people who will invest in companies in Ohio, and there are people who will not invest in companies in Ohio, right? And talk to the people who will. Somebody once said, I thought it was really great. Like, you can have an investor tell you their thesis like all day long, but if you really want to know what their thesis is, go look at their portfolio page, right? Sure. Like if their portfolio page is all companies in San Francisco, like there's some signal there, right? But if you've got an investor who says, I'd love to invest outside of the Valley, like their portfolio page will show you that, like, yes, they're actually investing in the regions where they say that they are. So you can do a lot of research to find, the right folks who will invest in your geography, who will invest in your stage, who will invest in your sector. And one of the things that we do with our founders is spend a lot of time really working on how to build that investor pipeline, how to do the investor research, right? Like, how do I figure out who are the right people for me to be approaching about the fundraising work that I'm doing right now?
That's awesome. Yeah, and that's honestly, that's probably revolutionary for a lot of founders is seeing this as a funnel, seeing this as an actual like marketing funnel, and you start with attracting the right people in the first place. It's really good.
Yeah. And you manage it the same way that you would manage a sales process, right? Like, people progress like until you get to close. And so we do work with our founders on fundraising, like, and so much of it is just being prepared, right? Like, if that's like somebody goes like, hey, what's the number one piece of advice that you give me on fundraising? And be like, be prepared, right? Like your business is at the right place to be ready to raise money, right? Step 1, build a great business. And then you've done your research on your investors, you know the message and the story that you're telling, and like make sure that you've done all of the hard work, right? Like in carpentry, they said, measure twice, cut once, right? It's really similar in fundraising. Like, do you have the right people in your pipeline? Are you talking to the right folks? Do you have the right story? Like, have you made the right amount of progress for the stage that you're at? So really just being prepared about it.
Man, that's awesome. Well, man, you've been really, really generous with your time, and I know you don't have a lot of it right now, especially in the middle of a program. So I appreciate you spending
any excuse I can get to sit down and talk with like you about like fun stuff like this, Josh. I'm done with it. I can do that.
That's awesome, man. Well, again, I thank you, and I guess before we wrap up, where can people find you, interact, kind of ask follow-up questions to the degree that you're willing to share?
Yeah, no, the best place
social or.
Yeah, the best place to find me is on Twitter. It's at Ryan Kuder. And I'm always happy to engage with folks who have questions there. The other thing that I would do is I would follow at Techstars, for announcements and upcoming accelerator programs and news about when applications open. And not only that, but, one of the things that we try to do at Techstars is to give first. It's a core value for us, and that Techstars account shares a lot of really great information and tips and tricks and ideas and knowledge that we've built up through the years with founders who are out there getting started right now. So
that's awesome. Well, Ryan, thanks so much for joining me. And when this is live, I hope you get lots of tweets and lots of potential great new companies to work with in the future.
Awesome, Josh. It's always a pleasure. And I just want to say thank you to you for the work that you do with the startups that you work with. We and the rest of the Techstars family really appreciate that a lot.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.